welcome to another episode of Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. Today, we're turning our attention to the celebrated English crime writer Reginald Hill. Born in the northeast of England, Hill is best known for his long-running series featuring Yorkshire detectives DL and Pascoe, spanning more than 20 novels. But beyond his mastery of crime fiction, Hill had a deep and recurring fascination with the First World War, not just as a historical backdrop, but as a lens to explore memory, justice, and the lingering impact of the past on the present. Perhaps one of the best examples of this is his 1996 novel, The Wood Beyond, where a modern-day investigation uncovers long-buried secrets from the war. More recently, Hill's engagement with the First World War resurfaced in his posthumous short story collection, A Candle for Christmas, published in 2023, where Silent Night revisits the famous Christmas truce of 1914 and the legendary football match that took place between the trenches.
Somebody turn on the Mark Connolly signal. Shine it in the sky.
See previous episodes. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me to discuss Reginald Hill and his use of the First World War in crime fiction are Jessica Meyer and Chris Kempshaw. Now, Jessica, you are our resident crime expert. Do you want to give us some background to Reginald Hill?
I can talk about my awareness of Hill's work. There's a personal story in that I was lent a copy of A Wood Beyond, which is the 7th or 8th book in the series, I think, of the DL and Pascoe novels, when I was in the first year of my PhD. And that was my introduction to him as a crime writer, although at that point I was already sort of quite aware of British crime writing. It was sort of Simon Brett at that point and the like, as sort of a genre. But that was my first introduction as Hill to these contemporaneous late 90s police procedurals, which really are a sort of genre in their own right. We talk about cozy crime and police procedurals. That era falls in between. They're not quite as gritty as some of what we think of as police procedurals today, perhaps, but they're certainly not cozy crime in any way.
Does it sit between Midsummer and the Sweeney?
Something, yes, that's a really good description. Basically, what's really interesting about them is that they have a lot of domestic concerns, but domestic political concerns. Other novels in the series deal with the miners' strikes in a lot of detail. Hill's really concerned with the late 20th century politics of Northern England and Yorkshire in particular. And his mid-Yorkshire is a fictional space, but it's one that has a lot of resonances, I suspect, for any of us who are living up here. A Wood Beyond, which has a lot of domestic concerns. It's about family and family legacy and memory, is very much part of this using detective fiction as a way of exploring social issues. It's detective fiction as social history, which is really what makes these books fascinating for me. So that one book, it becomes very obvious Hill is fascinated by. But unlike some of his other books where he looks at pornography or gay rights, which become the central focus of that particular book, and then sort of don't really necessarily reappear as a theme. The First World War is a theme that comes up again and again and again. And sometimes it's just wasn't Haig a bastard comment, which seems to come up across multiple books and short stories. And sometimes, as in Silent Night, it's the focus. He's really interested in the history of the First World War. And the Second World War just doesn't appear in anything like the same way.
In the interest of full disclosure to the listeners, I didn't get a chance to finish or read the novel, but I did read the short stories. And even ignoring Silent Night, the short stories opens with DL and Pascoe one, and there's a throwaway reference to the Christmas truce in it, where I think he makes a comment to DL that if he'd have been part of the Christmas truce, he'd been sent off for fighting. But it's that kind of, the First World War is just as a language that clearly he goes back to as a reference point.
Yeah, and there's another one. In that collection, the one about, I can't remember the title now, and of course I've left my copy at home, the one about the pub and the argument, they all try and make controversial statements as part of a pub game that they develop. And Pascoe's Sally is something about Haig being a bastard. So yeah, it becomes a lodestone for Hill in really interesting ways, which is why I suggested this might be a good subject.
In A Wood Beyond, it at least makes 2 references to Haig, and I did actually even make.
Should we give a quick summary of what is rather a complicated plot?
Well, I found the plot remarkably complicated, actually, to follow.
There's two parallel investigations. One is the contemporary investigation, which is around animal rights raids on research facilities, medical research facilities. And the crime there is the murder of a guard who gets hit over the head during one of Redcar, during one of these raids, and dies. Someone has killed this guard, and it's trying to identify, if it's the animal rights group, who the animal rights group is and who has actually done it. So that's the contemporary investigation. And then there are these bones, which turn out to be historic bones, which feed into the historical investigation, which is a family history, becomes a family history investigation for Peter Pascoe, because his family is implicated in this historical investigation around what happens to the men of his family who served in the First World War, one of whom was shot for cowardice, and one of whom apparently deserted. And it gets very complicated because it involves brothers. It involves someone who has the same name, a second Peter Pascoe.
I was literally about to say, how many of these are going to end up sharing the same name?
Exactly, yeah. So we have many Pascoes, 2 Peter Pascoes, and the relationships are quite hard to tease out. There is also a character in the book who spans both sides of the story, in that they were in the First World War and have now lived long enough to be, I think, ultimately interviewed right at the end, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, but it's weirdly, it's sort of hand-waved away. I was expecting some big reveal from the old fella, but they kind of don't need to go through him. It's all sort of omitted without speaking to him, which I was quite surprised at.
So yeah, it is a complicated plot, but fundamentally there are 2 crimes that are being investigated, which then have links with each other.
Conveniently dovetail together at the end.
Yes. And then there's sort of various symbolic ways in which I'm not sure animal rights raids are quite acquainted with French raiding in the First World War, but sort of the landscape around these facilities has become like the Western Front. There are duckboards and trenches and blasted trees and craters and things.
The animal rights people are attacking the guards with wire cutters. So sort of, trench raiding again, sort of raising its head there.
But one of the interesting things, of course, is that the animal rights movement is a females group. It's a women's group. And that plays into one of the other themes. Gender relations are a really big part of all of the D.L. and Pascoe novels, and the development of feminism from the 1980s onwards in relation to various other social groupings in the north of England. Yeah, so you do get women involved in violence in various ways.
It's curious, this is 1996 this comes out. I don't know when Who Do You Think You Are first aired, but it's sort of riding that memory boom of him discovering his great-grandfather's past through museums and letters, journals that turn up.
Yeah, it definitely precedes Who Do You Think You Are. This is earlier than that. And one of the ways I think in which that's slightly expressed is that instead of going to, the Who Do You Think You Are magazine or turning to Ancestry or something, and this is too early for the internet in that sense, but instead of looking for a genealogist, Peter talks to a professional academic historian who is the most unlikely, even for an Australian historian, I think is the most unlikely academic created in fiction that I've encountered. She's not dispassionate in any way, shape or form in her attitudes.
No, it's interesting about this. She comes with the war was wrong. They were murdering. She was probably one that mentions Haig being a murdering bastard.
Yep, she definitely does.
So, but it adds a certain gravitas to the whole feel of the opinion that Hill puts forward, and he's almost reinforcing that with his fake academic.
Oh, absolutely. I think the moment isn't so much the family history boom, which is now very much part of the context for which we think about the First World War, as much as this is the period of lobbying for pardons for those shot for desertion. It's the height of the Shot at Dawn campaign. What was the date that John Major refused to pardon? Shot at Dawn lobbies, there's a refusal to pardon, and then the Labour government ultimately pardons them. So 96 is before the actual pardon, but
93. Yes, I think it's 93.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Because I looked up when was the Ian Hislop Not Forgotten, where that documentary where he investigates, and it was a lot later than I remembered. It's 2005.
That's later, yeah. So I think that's it. That is the political context that this and social context that this novel fits into.
Which fitting in as well, I guess that's something I hadn't really considered. You get the Labour government coming in, you're riding that tide on the back of the miners' strike, and there is all that social context about his First World War characters are working class characters who worked at mill with their CEO being mill owner kind of thing. But I have to say, I hate it when books write in the vernacular. It really bugs me.
The actual pardon is granted in 2006. That's so much later than I thought it was.
Well, that fits with Hislop's 2005 documentary.
My memory of the Hislop documentary was that it wasn't focused on the Shot at Dawn. It was focused on the names on the monuments. And in that sense, Hislop very much was picking up on the who do you think you are genealogy and, the rise of ancestry moment. So it's less about the political campaigns to get these 306 men pardoned, which is, I think, what Hill is responding to, as much as it is, well, who are all the other 750,000 men who died, which still leaves the 4 million men who didn't die to be discussed.
Come now, Jessica, everybody died, you know this.
I know, the whole entire generation lost.
Or came home injured, like the officer who suffered from
post-traumatic stress disorder, which, as Jessica will tell us, is identical to shell shock.
Indeed. That I thought quite interesting, because he, if I recall correctly, Hill never makes the claim that shell shock is PTSD. It is shell shock. And
I don't even think he uses the word shell shock. He uses
neurasthenia.
Yeah, he uses neurasthenia.
And that is entirely accurate. To that extent, there are some extensive historical debates ongoing about how widespread was psychological trauma after the war. And I'm not sure I agree with Jay Winter's argument that it was as much as 25% of the entire population of returned men. I think that's based on a very broad definition of what we mean by psychological trauma. But of course, that's a medical debate as well. What do we classify as trauma? But certainly well more than the 60,000 men who got a pension for shell shock were trauma, suffered from some form of psychological trauma. There's no question. It's more than was officially recognized, although perhaps less than some historians would claim. There's a historian out there who claims that everyone who received a pension for debility was actually suffering from shell shock, which
that seems like a lot.
It's not a definition of debility that I'm entirely comfortable with, let's say. So I think in that sense, Wood Beyond, it's very much of its particular historical and political moment in some ways, but it's also, I think, in some ways, a bit like Regeneration, which it is, that's the cultural context in which Hill is writing. This is when Pat Barker's writing Regeneration, and I'm trying to remember the date of Japrisot's A Very Long Engagement. So suddenly you have this literature of the First World War, and that in part is what the context that Hill is working with, and it's sort of the groundwork for when we think about the First World War as genealogy, or indeed
Birdsong coming along in 93 as well.
That's right, yeah, which is another one with one of these dual.
I always forget the parallel narrative because I always find it slightly tedious, the modern day bit. And I'm not sure if the first time I read it, I just skipped it.
And of course, it got completely eliminated from the television series. I like the modern narrative in Birdsong. I found that in some ways more convincing than some of the history.
Yeah, since I read Birdsong.
Yeah, so I'd have to revisit it. I rewatched the TV series and was slightly underwhelmed and disappointed. And it sort of put me off rereading the book, but I should revisit it. What I'm curious about, Jessica, and I completely dropped the ball on this because it never occurred to me. Have you ever watched the Wood Beyond as the TV series?
No, I haven't, because I never got into the DL and Pascoe TV series particularly, and the few I did watch never seemed. Hill's quite a complex novelist as a detective novelist. There are a lot of layers and a lot going on. A 2-hour BBC television drama was never going to capture that. And as wonderful as I can't remember the actor who plays DL. As wonderful as he's never going to capture the complexity of that character. For those who haven't encountered Andy DL, he is an anti-hero of Falstaffian proportions and with all the complexity of Falstaff as well.
Kind of perennially referred to as the Fat Man. Indeed. By Pascoe.
One of the later books in the series is it's either Death and the Fat Man or Death Comes for the Fat Man. I can't remember, and they had to change that for the American audience.
Warren Clark,
that's it. Yeah. And he's a great actor, don't get me wrong. But yeah, just as a fictional creation, the DL works better on the page than on the screen. Have you watched the television adaptation?
No, 20 minutes before we were about to start this, it popped into my head, I wonder if they'd had adapted it. And I did a very quick YouTube search and turned it up and kind of skipped it through. And there's Frances Barber's in there as the main female. And they'd reenacted First World War flashbacks. Yeah, there was a guy shooting himself in the foot. And
what was the date of the television adaptation then?
1998. So it was not on my radar at all in the 90s, wasn't the TV series.
My parents used to enjoy it. And I imagine that on, UK TV Crime Gold +1, you can watch it forever, hour after hour.
When I was growing up, you used to get, in the States, you used to get mail order companies that would sell you the DVD collections of BBC dramas. DL and Pascoe was one of them. Oh, you can get DL and Pascoe on iPlayer. Yeah, and they did straight adaptations, didn't they?
It's season 3, episode 4.
Well, we should have done our due diligence, and
it slightly irked me when it suddenly occurred to me that I'd never thought to check.
I think I'd always assumed that they hadn't done straight adaptations, because by series 10, they're doing.
They must run out of books.
They've run out of books at that point.
In 90 minutes, there's a lot of complexity to try and weave in. Well, I imagine there's perhaps complexity that doesn't need to be there, such as his grandmother requests that her ashes are scattered at the Regimental Museum. Is it outside the Regimental Museum and it's some form of protest? But the Regimental Museum's moved.
Yeah, they'll do that.
The advantage of the dual narratives is, and whatever we think of the history, by having it through contemporary, modern day Peter Pascoe's perspective, as well as these diary entries that aren't allowed to throughout, you do get a sort of sense of the process of history. And that's what I liked about the contemporary narrative in Birdsong as well, that it's not just the author's interpretation of the history, it's the author's interpretation of the process of doing history. And of course, the earliest example of that is Josephine Tay's The Daughter of Time, which is not First World War, but is about doing history, which I've just been lecturing to my second-year students about.
Well, it's interesting, one of the characters they bring that gives you that interpretation of their grandfather's interpretation is the officer who was Pascoe's great-grandfather's friend during the court-martial, who's fairly adamant that his grandfather thought the politicians were profiteers and the generals, most of them, were in their pockets and too scared or stupid to stand up to say enough's enough. So there's a sort of an agenda all the way through, even though he's imprinting that upon his characters who claim to have got it from their relatives who were there contemporary at the time.
The ghostly spectre of Alan Clark reaching out from beyond the grave.
Absolutely. But this is also, if we think about the historiography, this is just about the jumping off point for Hague revisionism. That sounds very pejorative. Don't get me wrong. I think there's a lot right about what the revisionists said about Hague. I'm not, but that is sort of the category that we need to think about. This is that period in the late 1990s is when historians, military historians, are really, against.
Yeah, start to push back.
Both Alan Clark, but also Corelli Barnett and others.
And also in pop culture terms, not in a sense of like kind of Michael Gove used to do it. Blackadder Goes Forth is far more recent. The Monocled Mutineer is far more recent. So that you do have some of this kind of more present pop culture portrayal of the war going on in the background at the same time.
I mean, I suggested talking about Hill because these republished short stories, and I don't know if it's in the collection. Again, I've left my copy at home, so I can't double check this, but a lot of these are republished. Is there anything in there, an acknowledgements page or about when the stories were first published? Because some of them are published, as Christmas specials in newspapers. Newspapers used to do this. We're not going to publish any original content over, any news content over the Christmas period. So have a short story to keep you occupied.
Have a little look. No.
The reason I suggested looking at Hill was because of this reissuing of these short stories, which is very much to capture, it's part of those Golden Age crime collections that they've been putting out every year since I think Martin Edwards started it with the British Library series a couple of years ago. So it's very much for that Christmas stocking market. But the fact that Silent Night then pops up as a story.
So one of the things that they do mention in the foreword is they flag up the Wood Beyond, saying, these various stories that have gone past. They talk about in one where DL takes on the role of Odysseus in the Iliad and says, well, The Wood Beyond was essentially a novel about the First World War, but set in the 1990s in mid-Yorkshire.
That's why I think it fits in as much with the war novels of that period, so Regeneration and Birdsong, as it does with the detective fiction of that period. The one with DL as Odysseus is called Arms and the Woman, and is the second best in the series. The absolute best is on Beulah Height. There's no question. But I'd say Arms and the Woman is the second best. And there's a wonderful one about the Profumo scandal as well.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah. Drug smuggling and the Profumo scandal.
There's going to be, I suspect there's going to be a certain subset of our audience who are possibly not familiar with the Profumo scandal, so that might be worth looking up.
Yeah.
It was a different time, I think, is possibly the an easy way to refer to it.
Indeed. I mean, basically, I'm going to come up with a recommendation of, if you haven't read Reginald Hill, for God's sake, go away and do. Various trigger warnings, particularly around sexual violence, and racism. But the man could write, basically. I mean, he's in that tradition of genre novelists who are just really good novelists, full stop.
I was slightly intrigued by Hill's own personal connection with the First War, and annoyingly I could dig very little up. His father was a professional soldier, but they don't really say what he was doing around the time of the First World War, though he was in the army and afterwards becomes a professional football player. And Hill himself misses the Second World War, but does do his national service. So it's quite ambiguous, quite what his connection with the war is.
And even more infuriatingly, I was trying to write something in the early 2000s when I sent Hill a questionnaire about his connection with the First World War, because I was trying to do something with that. And I cannot, for love or money, find it anywhere on my old computer files. He did. He was really, really nice. He filled out my questionnaire for me. He wouldn't do an interview, but he filled out my questionnaire for me. And then I never did anything with it. And it's somewhere lost in a backup file somewhere. I just have no idea where.
One day it'll reappear.
Yeah, I can't think of the correct keyword. Somehow it's not turning up. Hill is not working well as a keyword.
The only real connection that any of this sort of online biographies that I could track down gave to him and his interest in the First World War tended to come from the fact that he was, I think he was an English teacher, and that perhaps it stems from him teaching the war poets and his love of the war poets, which sort of fits, to be fair, some of the sort of things he's coming out with.
Although there's very little Wilfred Owen. One of class is a big obsession, and the Yorkshire connection. So there is Child's Play, I think it is. Exit Lines. Sorry, Exit Lines, which is one of the earlier novels, which quite clearly is built on his family connection to, has a storyline that's about military service. I assume it's the West Yorkshire Regiment. It's the Mid Yorks in this case, but I think it's based on the West Yorkshire Regiment. I think that family history of coming from a military family shapes the interest in that sense, not necessarily the cultural history side of things. I think that's probably where he's coming into the war from.
Can I ask, this might not be directly Hill related, but he invents a regiment, doesn't it, as you say? He invents the West Yorkshire Fusiliers. Do you think that's better to invent a regiment rather than use a real one? Do you lay yourself open for criticism for bending history? Rather than just make stuff up?
It's probably easier because then you can talk about them being in particular actions without somebody going, but they weren't. and we have the.
But it becomes so clear that he's going to Leeds, and you think, well, why don't you just use the proper regiment?
It's in a great tradition. Jane Austen refers to the Blankshires. That's very much a 19th century tradition of not.
And we had the heroic, was it the West Pennine Fusiliers who disappeared off to an alien planet?
Well, we did, but they've been written out from history because of their disappearance. There's probably a file somewhere in an archive that's top secret about that one. It'll turn up.
And who's the 19th century novelist who had the Loam shows? Anyway, there's a grand tradition of inventing regiments for fictional purposes.
Yeah, given that it's the starting characters are fictional, I think you buy yourself a bit of leeway by then kind of okay, we're going to draw on real events, but we're going to fictionalize the regiment for. I
just find it's so, because the thing is, it is fictional, but at the same time, his Mid Yorkshire is also fictional. There's no such place, which his Mid Yorkshire seems to float genuinely around all three ridings quite happily, irrespective how enormous Yorkshire and its ridings are. It floats about as though they're all next door to one another.
But that isn't specific to this novel. That happens because what it really affects is the demarcations of the different police forces. So it has to be that big so that DL and Pascoe can get involved in crimes in all sorts of weird and wonderful places.
But I just sort of thought, well, as it sort of floats about, I mean, why invent something when you could have just picked one of the local regiments? They'd probably have that many battalions. There'd be one somewhere where you needed it to be.
It is partly, a sort of grand literary tradition. The town where the police force is based, the Mid York's police force is based, is some weird cross between Sheffield and Thirsk, as far as I can make out.
Funny thing is, I'm fairly sure that Mid Yorkshire would probably be York, because I think York's traditionally where all the ridings met. So and then they're talking about Redcar. So living just north of Thirsk, I'm fully aware of the geography, and so this is probably very personal to me because I know the area. It was vaguely annoying wafting this pin around, trying to put pin-ins in places.
You can't do that with Hill's work. I'm sorry, just because he's got so there's a very important cathedral close in the city, which probably is based on York. Then there's a park and a canal which have nothing to do with York, as I can work it out.
Because other detectives, I mean, obviously, Midsummer Murders is a famous one, a place that doesn't exist. But I know that a lot of London-based ones always used to be set in the fictional borough of Denton, like The Bill used to be, Touch of Frost used to be.
And any Oxford or Cambridge novel invents a college. You cannot do anything else. Colin Dexter had a college that appeared sort of consistently across about 5 different Morse novels, if I recall correctly. I can't remember what it was called. Deborah Crombie went for All Saints as her Cambridge college, which is nice and safe. Just to bring it back to the historical, it does create. I mean, I think, Angus, you're quite right. It does create an issue for the historian using this as a potential source to understand the regional specificity of what's going on.
Well, so I think the interesting about wafting it around mid-Yorkshire, Yorkshire's such a big county, it gives you kind of a very northern view of who's fighting the war, and it allows you to go from country, gentleman, officer class, kind of rural types to really heavy industrial Leeds, Bradford types without really going, oh, well, we're West Yorkshire or we're North Yorkshire that doesn't have the industry. That does allow it to sort of waft about generally, but creates a very northern view of the war.
I mean, it fits in very nicely with your PhD, doesn't it? Because the whole justification for why you were looking at Yorkshire was that it covers all these sort of social variations in ways that London or the home counties doesn't.
With the regiment that you're talking about, the fictional one, and that you know the various characters were in, or kind of family members were in.
The West Yorkshire Fusiliers.
West Yorkshire Fusiliers. Do they talk about any of the battalions? Are they pals? Does it come up? Because again, that's you know the emphasis on pals battalions is also quite a northern view of the war.
No, I think they were volunteers.
There's a plot point based on peer pressure or workplace peer pressure, the expectations that men in the workplace would sign up en masse, and that sort of peer pressure is exerted, and that's quite important so that because they do all end up in the same battalion essentially.
So kind of pals adjacent.
With the mill owner's son being one of the officers.
But it does actually fit in with Helen McCartney's discussion of the Liverpool Territorials. You know, they are volunteer. They're I think they're terriers by another name essentially, but they have to slightly get round the lag in, you know, the way in which volunteers were allocated circa 1914, 1915. So there's some fudging, but then given that at that period, there's a lot less research narrative around the different ways. It was still sort of living memory that there was clear distinctions between the regulars, the terriers, and the new army. And people like Peter Simkin are talking about the new army, but nobody's really talking about what's the difference between a territorial regiment and the regulars at this point in terms of regional recruitment. There's not a lot about sport.
Is there anything about cross-dressing?
No, it's quite a lot about socialism and Russian revolutions, and that's why they hang him. Well, not hang him.
There's a lot about the politics, actually. But yeah, no cross-dressing, sadly. There's cross-dressing in other Hill novels.
Ultimately, I got the feeling that he's shot rather than for the cowardice, for the accusation that backs up the cowardice, that he's a socialist. He's a socialist and an agitator at the mill.
Yeah, I mean, that's the underlying argument, isn't it? That he's not shot for any justifiable military reason, or even an unjustifiable military reason. It becomes murder in that sense. He needs to be silenced by the political powers that be.
Which is one of the underlying sort of themes of the contemporary storyline, is that these women are animal rights protesters. But prior to that, they'd been protesting with the miners on the miners' strike.
Some of them had, not all of them, because the animal rights group parallels. There's an officer class woman. It's quite literally the wife of and mother of an officer, and then the working class. Right.
Is this a nice, fun little kind of munition workers hierarchy thing of the working class women in the factories and the middle class women policing them after hours?
There's actually very little about munitions work in the factories. That's quite interesting about the women. They stay at home. They don't go into the factories necessarily. Hill's quite good at women as a general rule, but the historical women in this novel are underwritten in favor of the contemporary women. There's a lot about women as wives and sweethearts and mothers, but not a lot. The historical women as wives and sweethearts and mothers, but not a lot about them as volunteers or munitions workers. That, I think, is, again, something of a reflection of the historical understanding at the moment at which the novel was written. A lot of those more complex histories of women's roles have only emerged since the turn of the 21st century, which is quite scary, actually, given how complex and nuanced a lot of those discussions are. But it's really quite a recent development in the historiography, actually, now I think about it.
Yeah, Andrew Marwick's The Deluge, in the grand scheme of things, is not that long ago.
No, but it also makes you realise just how much work Sue Grayzel, Tammy Proctor, Alison Fell have done in the interim. Yeah.
Would it be fascinating to see Reginald Hill's First World War bookshelf, to see what books he's pulling down for his reference?
Somewhere in my notes is, who are your main sources?
That sense is very similar to what I ended up doing with a bunch of computer game developers, basically asking them, so what books are you reading to get this stuff from? And some of those answers are really interesting.
Yeah, but for 1996, you've got no internet. You've not got video on demand like we have video on demand. If a program are there, chances are you may never see it again. So you're looking at books, you're looking at the written word.
But the other thing is you're drawing on what you learned at school.
Assumptions, yeah.
Yeah.
Or what he's teaching at school.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
All of those useful records haven't been digitized and sold by Ancestry and Find My Past yet.
Which is why it's interesting that there, because he was an English teacher, but there is very little war poetry, actually. There's not even a lot of Robert Graves. Goodbye to all that. He spoke a lot less about Silent Night and its representation of the football.
Well, it's a bit thin, isn't it? I started reading it, it's sitting down for a long haul, and discovered 10 minutes later it was over.
It's a short story. I mean, that's the joy of the short story, right? But also, I thought it might have been interesting to think about as a ghost story, and the way in which the First World War, having done the warm hands of ghosts, this is a very different take on the First World War as a site for ghosts to haunt.
So the story, a boy's going out to meet his family or his friends for a carol service, isn't he?
Yeah, his young lady, I think, is predominantly there, and he's perpetually running late, and it's never entirely clear whether or not he is doing this in the past or doing it in the present, and then he stumbles across a ghostly football match.
But that's only after knocking a relative's photograph off the wall or breaking the frame of them during the First World War. And then, he's taking a shortcut through the woods.
I think calling the main character Tommy Atkins was a little on the nose.
I think he has to be called Tommy at one point because
Germans would just say, "Come over, Tommy, come on."
Yeah. So somebody has to address him as Tommy, and he thinks it is him in particular. So, and there were genuinely men called Thomas Atkins who served in the First World War.
Oh yeah.
And a few of them have pensions.
I'm not quite sure what that story is doing, because as a ghost story, I found it not particularly frightening. And
it's not very, or creepy.
And it kind of could see what was happening. Oh, look, they're singing Silent Night in German. Oh, right. Oh, look, they've got a football out. Okay, and now they're off.
Yeah, I know where this is going.
Which is why I think it was one of these commissions for a Christmas newspaper. Because there is this tradition of Christmas ghost stories, right, going back to the 19th century, as filler. So the journalists don't have to work. You commission for the Saturday before or after Christmas someone to write a short story, and this is what he produced. Write us a ghost story.
I much preferred the one about sailors eating each other. That was a good one.
Yes, that was creepy.
That was creepy.
Oh yeah, it certainly sounded like, felt a bit like Beulah. It was. It was. I just thought it was a bit thin. There was no, when you have a short story, you kind of want to have a payoff, a kind of ta-da moment at the end, and it's sort of not there. You're like, oh. There was no big reveal, minor quip, minor joke, shock.
No twist.
No twist. It was not there. You're like, oh.
Well, I think perhaps the twist was it was all a ghost story, but because we're reading this as First World War historians, so like, well, it has to be, right?
Yeah, I can't rule out the possibility that in a roundabout way we are not the audience for this.
Yeah. Not this one in particular.
You could have almost finished it and he was back in time for tea. Would have been a bigger shock.
Angus, did you enjoy The Wood Beyond? I know, Chris, you haven't read it.
I had a bit of a love-hate relationship with it. I got frightfully confused at times of what was happening, and I'd just let it wash over me, because it does get really complicated. And trying to track the ancestry down at the end was who to what to whom to. I just kind of it was fine. I could never quite work out which bit I was enjoying most, whether it was the First World War bit that was slightly irking me at times, or the modern day investigation where I would get slightly confused at, and then slightly horrified at DL's sleeping with the main. I mean, you can't have this even in the 90s. If this was the Sweeney, perhaps that would be acceptable. So, no, I'm not sure I'd be rushing out to read another Reg Hill book. It's interesting that Mick Herron wrote the foreword for the collection, which I would be quite interested to read, a Slough House, which probably has nothing to do with the First World War whatsoever. But that did put that in mind. Yeah, I'm not sure I'd be rushing out, but I would be intrigued to watch the TV episode. I could see a wet Sunday afternoon dragging that up to watch, because I would be intrigued to watch that. I've never seen any of them, but I think that would be quite interesting to see how it's played out, especially as I know exactly what's happening.
As I said, I'm not quite sure to the extent to which the television programs follow the book, because they have to get it all into 2 hours. But
as I say, he does that slightly thing that I don't like it reading the vernacular. I don't mind listening to it, but it just grates with me.
I think it's whoever plays Peter Pascoe. I think he reads the audiobooks for Audible. So yeah, if you are interested in listening because of the vernacular, I have listened to the audiobook, and I think that's quite good because they use the vernacular voice to distinguish between the past and the present, which would otherwise be quite difficult. Chris, have we convinced you that you need to actually spend some time reading the novel?
Oh, I imagine I will sit down and read it at some point. But God, like the last one was just a write-off, basically. In it.
For our audience, if you like detective novels, even if you want to avoid this one, I too have a love-hate relationship with this one in particular, but there are some of the DL and Pascoe series that I just adore, and we'll read over and over again. Not this one necessarily. I struggle a little bit with the female academic from Australia as a representation.
She didn't seem to do much in it. Her contribution was very light. You could have almost edited her out and nothing would have changed the story. I think that the rather large suspension of disbelief at the end to tie everything together for me was a bit, oh, well, good grief.
Does the female academic do enough to build an impact case study out of this? Because that's the most important thing. Is her contribution referable?
No. No, unfortunately,
it's a human tragedy.
But anyway, for our listeners, I hope you might consider exploring Reginald Hill's work. It's good fun.
Good. Do we know what we're exploring next time out then, Chris? I don't think we do we?
Nope.
We're talking beforehand.
That's an easy one. Snoopy does the Red Baron.
Throwing things out like hand grenades going, oh, I don't know.
Given that, to give a sense of when we're recording this, Dope Girls is on BBC. Do we want to have a watch of that? And I will explore some experts on the 20s and 30s who might come on and talk to us about Dope Girls.
Very good. I was just trying to look it up. Can't find it anyway. It'll turn up. Yeah, no, that'd be great. Cool. Well, if that's it for this time out, thank you very much. I guess we'll see you all next month.
Indeed. Thank you. Bye.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Comfort, Richard, how can we spend the Bolivian? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.